Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today for a press conference from civil society at the 12th Ministerial Meeting of the WTO. We are calling for the transformation of WTO rules and have a number of important points to make from various civil society groups around the world. My name is Deborah James, and I'm the Director of the International Programs at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and I'm the facilitator of the Global Our World is Not for Sale network. The WTO's 12th Ministerial commences this afternoon, and for a year and a half, rich country governments have refused to negotiate on the life-saving critical need to remove WTO obstacles to COVID-19 pandemic by waiving intellectual property rules at the WTO. At the same time, there is a very anti-development text on the table, and fisheries subsidies and the agriculture outcomes will likely do little to address the global food insecurity while punting serious reforms to the future. Perhaps most existentially, developed countries are pushing a WTO reform agenda that threatens the very basis of the WTO, multilateralism and consensus, in favor of plurilaterals, differentiation among developing countries, and an even more direct role and power for corporations, expanding the failed WTO model rather than transforming it. At least 50 civil society representatives are here in person for MC12 from at least 22 different countries: India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Philippines, the Pacific Islands, Ghana, Malawi, Morocco, South Africa, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, the USA, Belgium, France, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. And we do have a media availability list of NGO experts, civil society experts, many of whom are here for Geneva, and I have hard copies of it here. And if you haven't received it yet, you can email me to get a copy of that. But instead of welcoming engagement for these diverse voices who have come from so far to represent their communities, CSOs have actually been banned from the WTO on June 12th, the opening day. We have been sidelined from the venue, as well as severely limited in our participation throughout the ministerial. And we've just put out a statement, brand new statement coming out today. We have hard copies of it here. If you receive this invitation from me, you will receive it. Otherwise, let us know, and I will share a copy with you. So thank you for coming here today to hear from communities who will be directly affected by the outcome of the WTO negotiations this week, but have been sidelined by the WTO in an effort to keep the illegal green rooms and anti-development agendas out of the light of day. So we have about 10 speakers. I'm going to really be tight with everybody because we have so many voices to hear from around the world. So I will ask you to wrap if you go over about 2.5, 3 minutes. I apologize for interrupting. But our first speaker, and we need to pass the mic for the recording, is Stephanie Prezioso, who is a member of parliament from the Swiss Confederation.
Thank you, Deborah. And just a few words to welcome everybody. I come from a country where the Swiss ambassador to the WTO does not hesitate to argue that lifting intellectual property rights would be counterproductive, arguing that the suspension of patents would discourage research and training. When we know that these companies spend more money on advertising than on research, this argument leaves us speechless. That's why it's so important for me as a member of the Swiss Parliament that all the civil society from all around the world are here today for the press conference to denounce what is going to happen in the WTO and to call also to the Swiss government to do something, because the Swiss government is working as a benchmark for the big pharma, and we cannot support that. We have to call against that. Because the Swiss government and all the European countries are going to be held accountable today and for the next month and years for all the dead people their politics are doing right now. So thank you, all of you, to be there and have a nice press conference.
Thank you, Stephanie. Our next speaker is George Poe William, and George is the Secretary General the Secretary General of the Nurses Union from Liberia.
Thank you. And so my union represents all of the health workers in Liberia, to include doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and the rest of the cadres of healthcare workers. Today, I speak to this body with a very heavy heart, because coming from the background of working by the bedside where we treat people with medicines that are made by big pharma, and knowing that we have a huge challenge at the bedside due to the fact that there are never sufficient supplies, especially so in a time of health crisis when people are dying. We come here to let the big farmers and all the governments, like the government of Germany, the government of Switzerland, the government of the UK, and the entire European Commission, to please see reason to waive these patents on medical supplies, medical products in the time of emergency, not only for COVID-19, but it starts now so that in the future, so many people will not have to lose their lives needlessly when there's technology available, and the money used to produce these products, 90% of it we know is public funds. How can we allow so many people to die when we can save their lives? And especially so when some people are making profit and others are dying, and more than 100 countries over 2 years now are begging for these patents to be waived. We come here today to ask passionately that the whole world will listen, and people who meet at WTO today, starting today, will realize that this is about lives. Let us put lives before profit. And that is why we are here from Liberia, to tell the world that we have seen too many people dying, deaths that could be avoided only if patents are waived. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. And to follow immediately, we have Anna Maria, the policy lead with People's Vaccine Alliance. Anna.
Thank you very much. So I am here representing the People's Vaccine Alliance, which is a movement of over 100 organizations worldwide, representing millions of people who have been calling for a waiver of intellectual property barriers, just as George has so passionately and eloquently described the need for. And let's be very, very clear what's at stake here. We are still in the middle of a global pandemic. We've lost over 15 million lives from this pandemic, many of them avoidable if they'd had access to vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. Since South Africa and India first made the proposal for a TRIPS waiver, 30,000 people have died every day, whilst the EU, UK, including the US, have all sat on their hands or actively obstructed negotiations on this crucial move. Let's be also very clear that what is proposed right now is not a TRIPS waiver. It doesn't reflect what South Africa and India and over 100 countries have been supporting for over 20 months. What we have, what we know, it would be unthinkable for the WTO to do nothing in response to this pandemic, but it is absolutely unconscionable that the agreement on the text on the table at the moment would actually add more barriers to vaccine production in developing countries, more barriers to increasing the supply, more barriers to ensuring fair access to these critical tools. Not only that, but it also excludes therapeutics and diagnostics, the tests and treatments that are needed right now and could be produced right now if those intellectual property barriers were lifted. We need to see urgent changes, and we're demanding a few essential changes. We need to immediately see the removal of those TRIPS plus barriers that have been added into the text. We need to see a waive of all intellectual property barriers on COVID technologies. This current agreement only relates to patents. We need to see other intellectual property barriers essential for the production of vaccines removed. We need to see the immediate inclusion of therapeutics and diagnostics. There can be no excuse for keeping these out of the agreement now. They could be saving lives now. And we need to see all countries eligible to use this agreement. We are in a global pandemic. We need to maximize supply. That means maximizing the number of producers around the world that could be making these life-saving tools. And let's also be incredibly clear here. The current deal on the table is worse than the status quo. We need to see the rich countries, especially the EU, UK and Switzerland, as well as the US, concede now, make major compromises on their positions to open the door for equitable access. And I also want to send a very clear message to developing countries that if these improvements are not made, we stand with them in rejecting this deal. Thank you.
So we do have some more speakers on the TRIPS waiver situation, but we're actually going to jump into some of the other policy issues. I'm going to introduce next Parminder Jeet Singh. He is from IT for Change from India.
Thank you, Deborah. You would have heard people talking here about some very bad decisions WTO has made, and even worse, omissions. And you will hear more about things in fisheries and agriculture. But I'm trying to tell you something which is even worse, perhaps, because there are bad decisions in that governments and institutions take, which could be reversed. But when you start fiddling with the very democratic character of an institution, then we are lost. And what is happening in the name of WTO reform, which is quite a deform really, today is an attempt to completely turn upside down the post-war, and here I mean the World War II, social contract by which we are governing ourselves as a world community, whereby every nation gets a vote and things are decided by consensus. Things are not perfect, but we need to make them more democratic. But here, in the name of reform, developed countries are using a crisis to completely upend the democratic nature of global governance. And I'll try to explain about it to you quickly by taking the example of parliaments. Think of, in your country, there's a parliament which does decision making. And some people start meeting on the side saying, oh, well, we're just talking among ourselves and this is not big. But soon the center of gravity of decision making shifts from the parliament to that private group. And the private group starts claiming that decision making will take place here. And that's what WTO is doing today in the name of WTO reform. It is starting a new way of global governance, which is very, very dangerous. And we should not be, deluded by this name reform. And we should ask people to stop this effort to upend the democratic and participative nature of WTO. And I'll just take a minute more about digital economy. Everybody in the world, including the US, where the digital economy is anchored, and China is trying to regulate big tech. You would have heard, everybody's trying to do that. Whether they will do it or not, there's only one institution in the world which is trying to stop tech regulation, and that's the WTO, which is trying to come up with a formula whereby it makes it impossible for countries to regulate big tech. And that's the thing which is called the Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce. It looks good again, but it's simply a rule book which will not allow countries to regulate big tech. And as I said, everybody wants to do it. That's the future where we need to regulate this big tech. So we want WTO to not go ahead with these plans, and we stand with all those member countries who are opposing them. Thank you very much.
IT for Change in India. Thank you. Our next speaker, continuing the issue of discussing digital trade / e-commerce, is Sofía Scacerra from the Instituto del Mundo de Trabajo at the University UNTREF in Argentina.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Okay. So for the past years, for the past decades, the WTO has renewed the moratorium on tariffs to electronic transmissions. We all know that these imply a really big loss of revenue for developing countries. Countries which have digital capacity need to protect themselves. Tariffs are important. Consumer taxes are not enough, because some countries replace these tariffs with consumer taxes, with internal taxes to platforms, and this is not enough. We don't need taxes revenues raised by big tech platforms, and having an even bigger burden on the consumer and moving local smaller platforms away from the market. Instead, we could charge tariff which will protect digital industrialization and jobs in the local markets, as well as local content. This is important for cultural reasons as well. Tariffs are a really important policy instrument to design local economy and to protect local production. The economy is now digital, and we need to stop the moratorium once and for all to be able to protect local economy and reach digital industrialization in developing countries in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia. Our next speaker is Fernando Hernandez. He is with a group called Wolfenden, based in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Deborah. I would like to say that as an European citizen, I'm really, really disappointed with the role that the EU has played in the WTO, especially with the role in blocking the EU TRIPS waiver, the TRIPS waiver as it was requested by South Africa and India. There seems to be a fight to defend the interests of the big companies, in particular pharma. We have to be very clear. What is being decided here can and will make a difference in 7 million of lives. That being said, on agriculture negotiations, we think the following. I'm going to try to be very, very, very brief. The public tax to be on the table from tomorrow focus more on exports and undermine the role that states can and must play in making sure that people do not go hungry. As civil society, we are disappointed to see that the commitment to decide on public stockholding on the MZ12 is gone. This had been already agreed by all the members, and the DG has taken it off the text. It's been postponed. Imagine, it's been postponed even though there is a looming food security crisis, and the invasion in Ukraine is actually leading towards more hunger in the world. We welcome, of course, that the World Food Programme proposal, the text that is being there, but it has to be in line with national food security policies. Food for humanitarian purposes is clearly a good thing, but the WTO must be more serious and get rid of unfair rules which also fuel food insecurity. We demand food, jobs, medicines, and sustainable development first and above the interest of the rich.
Thank you so much. Going back to the TRIPS issue, I'm going to introduce next Alan Rossi Silva, who is with the Brazilian Interdisciplinary AIDS Association.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to highlight how the COVID-19 crisis was severe in our region, in Latin America and in Brazil. Almost 1/3 of total deaths happened in Latin America. It was in fact devastated by the pandemic. In Brazil alone, we had more than 670,000 deaths and counting to today. And in spite of this severe crisis, regarding vaccines, we are subjugated by late, extortive, arbitrary, and secret contracts with transnational corporations. Regarding treatments, the fact is that in 2021, none of the WHO recommended drugs were available at our public health system. A real waiver could have saved many lives in our region. This is the fact. And the current proposal that we are seeing today is a shame. There is no other word for that. WTO, it must be said, has completely failed when it was most needed. And it's failing now, during this week. Pressure from developed countries and their transnational corporations, imperialism and neoliberalism are holding us hostage. So, to conclude, I would like to say that it's time to honor our history and the people we lost during this crisis. It's the moment of, first, denouncing the fake negotiation process and walking away from the current text. Secondly, implementing and improving TRIPS flexibilities at a national level. But it's not enough. Above all, we need to demand a multilateral solution that can really save lives in times of emergency. For example, automatic TRIPS waiver for this and other pandemics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like next to introduce Sangita Shashikant from the Third World Network based in Geneva.
I'm Sangita from Third World Network. I'm going to focus on the decision text. So we have heard the narrative that no one is safe until everyone is safe. We have heard many promises of international solidarity, but we do not see this reflected in the draft ministerial decision that the ministers are going to consider in the coming days. What do we have on the table? We have a decision that is limited only to vaccines. It does not even cover tools, all the tools required for the manufacturing of vaccines, although the objective is production and supply of the vaccines. We have seen the Swiss, UK, EU trying to narrow the scope of the decision and adding conditions that do not exist in the TRIPS agreement, essentially undermining the existing TRIPS flexibilities. The decision does not address therapeutics. It has delayed any decision on therapeutics by 6 months. And we know WTO is notorious for not meeting any kind of timelines. We have spent about 18 months coming to where we are now. Are we going to wait for another 18 months, 2 years, 3 years for therapeutics? Why are therapeutics being delayed? Why is it not part of the decision? This is because US, UK, Switzerland, and potentially the EU don't want therapeutics included. That is why the paragraph is also in brackets. We actually need therapeutics included in all aspects of the decision right now. Why we see that nationally developed countries have all employed therapeutics to control COVID-19. So why are they denying the rest of the world? We have eligibility criteria. This is an issue that has not been resolved. It has not even been discussed during the text-based negotiation. Why are all countries that have the production and export capacity not allowed to use the decision? It's being limited. So I think this is a major problem for us moving forward. We also have language in the decision that prohibits re-exportation. There are burdensome obligations on notifications. There are many different conditions attached to the use of compulsory license. And these are all TRIPS plus requirements that are not there in the TRIPS agreement. We are in a health emergency, and I think WTO members have to remember what we need is a decision that works during a health emergency, and what we have on the table does not do that, and it is totally unsuitable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And next we have Francoise Nadeau from Collectif Brevet sur les vaccins anti-COVID Stop Réquisition, if I pronounce that properly, from France, and she will be speaking in French.
Oui, donc le collectif Brevet Stop Réquisition sur les vaccins anti-Covid est un collectif qui regroupe plus d'une cinquantaine d'organisations associatives, syndicales, et autour de cette question de la levée des brevets de l'accès aux vaccins et aux traitements. Et on insiste bien, nous aussi, sur la levée vaccins et traitements. Donc depuis 2 ans, en fait, rien n'a avancé finalement parce qu'on nous mène un peu en bateau, c'est le moins qu'on puisse dire, avec des pseudo-négociations qui aboutissent à des reports, à aujourd'hui quelque chose qui ne nous satisfait absolument pas, puisque excluant d'emblée les traitements, alors que les pays riches dont fait partie la France et l'Europe, l'Union européenne, se sont accaparés 90% pratiquement des vaccins du monde. Donc voilà, c'est quelque chose de totalement inacceptable. On a fait en sorte que le prix des vaccins n'a jamais été aussi élevé que celui des vaccins anti-Covid, alors que nous étions face à une crise sanitaire mondiale, à une pandémie. Et pour autant, les États, les gouvernants n'ont pas pris les décisions et sont restés attentistes pour le moins, voire ont carrément freiné pour ne pas remettre en question l'ordre économique mondial. C'est la logique commerciale qui a prévalu encore une fois et qui prévaut encore dans ce qui nous est proposé à l'heure actuelle. Donc nous sommes de ceux qui affirmons que les vaccins et les traitements, dispositifs médicaux et tests anti-Covid devraient être des biens communs de l'humanité, mais véritablement des biens communs, c'est-à-dire à ce titre comme considérés hors système du commerce, hors commerce, ce qui implique bien évidemment la levée des brevets, mais aussi le partage des savoir-faire et des technologies. Et si on veut pouvoir à un moment donné faire face à une réémergence du Covid, en ce moment en France, on est de nouveau face à une augmentation. On a augmenté en une semaine de 25% le nombre de nouveaux cas. On a un système hospitalier qui s'écroule avec des situations extrêmement dramatiques. Et pour autant, on continue de la même manière. Et si on veut pouvoir faire face à ces recrudescences et à une nouvelle pandémie, ben oui, il va falloir qu'on impose véritablement la sortie de ce système commercial et remettre en question la propriété intellectuelle sur les vaccins, les médicaments et les traitements.
Thank you so much. And next we have Adam Wolfenden. He is with the Pacific Network on Globalization from the Pacific Islands, and he will be talking about the fisheries subsidies.
Thank you, everyone. So the fisheries subsidies negotiations at the moment, we've seen the new text come out just the other night. And what the text does is it tries to pretty up what is essentially a very ugly deal for development and for sustainability. The Sustainable Development Goal mandate was clear. It said there must be appropriate and effective special and differential treatment. We're not seeing that in the text. We're seeing the big fishing fleets, those who have historically overfished the waters and are most responsible for the state of global fish stocks. They're not targeted, they're not explicitly addressed in this text. And for an environmental sort of supposed outcome, when you don't target the biggest polluter, then you're not really addressing the problem. And then on the other side, you have small-scale fishers, those least responsible for overfishing, the most precarious workers, and in this industry, they're not excluded. There is some limited scope for flexibility for them, but when you have such a vulnerable community, to have them tied up in these negotiations it's a terrible outcome for development. It's a terrible outcome for people's livelihoods. Like I mentioned before, the flexibilities for developing countries, they're completely inadequate. It's all based on timelines. There's heavy criteria for countries to be able to meet and actually utilize these flexibilities. They have to, fit within, percentages of global marine catch. They have to then meet all the very burdensome notifications. And we're hearing from governments that what's being asked of them is incredibly steep. And, the question has to be asked is if they can't meet those requirements, then they lose the special and differential treatment, which is, again, it fails the mandate that was set from leaders under Sustainable Development Goal 14.6. The other aspect that we're very worried about is the way that the WTO will now become a forum for the conservation and management measures of different members. So the way the sustainability flexibilities present in the text is, a member will have to notify of how they manage their stocks if they subsidize them. And we're seeing that then, when the review process happens, that opens those management measures up for questions, for disputes as well. Now, countries have the sovereign right to manage their fish and manage their waters. And what the WTO text is doing is it's coming in and undermining existing international treaties on conservation and management measures. And that is, we've seen the WTO's track record on the environment. It is a shameful record. And we're bringing fish into that is just going to exacerbate what is already a very complex and nuanced issue. And so I guess I'll just leave it at that. And our perspective is that if the text doesn't change dramatically, and I mean very dramatically, we would encourage members to walk away. It's not the price isn't worth what they're actually getting in return, which isn't much. So thank you.